Okay.
I'm looking for the official. Yeah, I better check my phone.
Gentlemen, start your engines.
Right. Good morning. We're going to call the Scott County Board of Commissioners July 7th. How did we get the July 7th meeting to order? If you would join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. Once again, we are gathered, socially distanced, masks in and out, so we're doing our thing. Let's move to item number 2, amendments to the agenda. I'm not seeing any, but I want to make sure. I don't.
Chairman?
Yes,
I'll move the agenda as it was presented.
Second.
we're gonna let it ride as is, as it was presented. Let's move to item number 3, approve minutes of the June 16th meeting. Are there any changes, additions, corrections to that packet that was in our electronic distribution?
Mr. Chair, I will move approval of those said minutes.
Second those.
Motion and a second of the minutes. Any discussion? Otherwise, we will once again look to Deb for a roll call vote, since we have Commissioner Ulrich is in attendance and just happens to be online. So take it away, Deb, please.
Commissioner Weckman-Brecky.
Aye.
Commissioner Wolf.
Aye.
Commissioner Beard.
Aye.
Commissioner Beer.
Aye.
Commissioner Ulrich.
All right, those minutes are approved. Now we're going to move to number 4, recognition of interested citizens. Favorite of mine for folks that want to address the board for any and all comments. I just also want to mention that even though we're in a little bit of a different scenario here, the building, people do watch that door if somebody wants to come in, or we all answer our phones and emails, and feel free to get a hold of us that way. But we see somebody behind a mask. It's Leslie. Take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I just wanted to take a couple minutes this morning for a celebration. We haven't had a lot of those in the last couple months, but we have a very special day, today actually, July 7th, 1980. Pam Johnson was hired by Scott County into our Employee Relations Department. And 40 years of service is something well worth recognizing. We've done it for a couple other folks. I know we changed our tenure awards, but the board did say they'd like to see folks who have significant accomplishments come before the board. And I think I had to kind of blackmail her into this, but she is here today. Her husband, Terry, has also come, as he's been a huge part of her support over the last 40-some years. But I just want to say, before I allow the board to say a few words as well, if you like, I think it's pretty amazing, her ability to work through, in labor relations, I think some of the most difficult things that we have to do in Scott County. And her empathy for everybody, and I mean everybody. If they're an investigation, if they're a supervisor, if they're a director, if they're a commissioner, to work with them and talk through the issues and find ways to negotiate and find good outcomes, I think for almost everybody involved most of the time, to me is, to be honest, it amazes me. It just is a skill that I don't think I've ever seen before in my career. And having that within our county, instead of having to outsource or have attorneys or other people working on these issues, but have somebody that cares about our staff, that cares about this organization working on these issues, I think has just been a blessing, at least in my 18, 19 years at Scott County. And so we have a whole bunch of staff out here, socially distanced with masks on here to recognize her, the few in the building today. But I think it just goes to show the respect and what she means to this organization. And I just think it's worth a couple minutes to recognize her dedicated service to the county and everything she has done for Scott County over the past 40 years. And with that, before we offer her to say a word or so, I'd open it up to the 4 or 5 of you if you have anything you'd like to say.
Well, I have one question. Who hired you, Pam?
Pam.
Who?
Pam.
Now you're getting in the real hot seat.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I was hired by Tom Longmire. He was the personnel director at the time, and when I was hired, there were 3 of us in the department. So we had Tom as the personnel director, I was hired as the personnel technician, and we had one support person.
And how many employees did we have here then?
Oh, 250, maybe
Holy
300
cow.
pushing it.
Okay, so we've tripled, huh?
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yes.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, you know, it's kind of, you know, the cameras are all pointed this way. Told Pam, sitting up at the tables, because we do have everything situated and keep people apart, I said she was in the hot seat. And then lo and behold, this suitor, Miss Masked Suitor, walked in the door with a bunch of roses. And I wish we should have pointed them that way just to kind of see the look on her face. But you know what I always hear time and time again is exactly what Leslie just said. You know, oh, we're grateful to have Pam here, you know, we got to walk through these labor contracts, you know, not always fun, but it makes it, because there's a caring, there is that empathy for everybody involved, that I just think it knits things together in ways that outside people can't do that, because you are on the inside, you see everything, and you care about everybody. We've got a mission that needs to be done, but we also have people to take care of, so you kind of knit that together pretty well. So we're looking forward to the next 40 years here at Scott County. Isn't that part of it too, or is that, maybe I didn't get the memo on that one. Maybe, well, let's compromise another 30 years at Scott County. We'll see you in the halls for the next 30 years.
Great, thank you very much, thank you.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chair. Pam, congratulations, thank you. What a great career, at least the beginning and maybe middle part of a great
Right,
career, not the end of it, definitely, we hope. And just like Leslie said, what good you've done for this organization, but that goes back to then what good you've done for the residents and taxpayers of Scott County. I think it's a perfect example of why we're all here. We want to do good for our friends and neighbors, but for this whole county. And you've showed us what public service looks like. You're a great model, and we should follow you. But thank you for that. Thank you for choosing public service in Scott County. People get sick of me saying that, but that's true. That's exactly why we're all here.
Right.
So it's a great accomplishment, and it's a wonderful vocation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to say thank you, Pam, congratulations as well. Apparently you were hired before child labor laws were put into effect.
I was thinking the same thing. Yes, exactly.
40 years, holy cow, and you, apparently the job agreed with you, because the stress and the strain does not show in your countenance or in your mannerisms or actions. You're a model, I think, for a lot of people. And Lord, I hope you were mentoring somebody to come along behind you, because you're going to leave a very large hole in the department because of the things, the values that you bring as a person, you know, the integrity and the trust and the empathy that have been talked about. They build trust, and trust is our stock in trade when we're dealing with the people's business. You've created that, and it's unquestioned. What an amazing thing. And I guess I could say I like to be like Pam when I grow up and have that kind of reputation. So if I ever do, it would be a good thing. Whoever you bring along behind you, I hope they have the time and the gift, I guess, to build that kind of trust. We need that. You've served the citizens well, this agency and the employees. Just one closing thought, you know, people don't always agree with you when you're in an adversarial position, but you manage somehow to not make it a prickly adversarial position. People can understand the difference of positions or starting points, perspectives, but still, you've not allowed the trust to be eroded. That's still there. And that's something I think we all, in these troubled times, could strive to emulate. How do we differ with someone and still maintain integrity and trust? And how do we still let a little empathy come through from time to time? Even though we may fundamentally disagree on some things, how do we display that kind of graciousness? You've modeled that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, when that resolution in payroll and personnel actions comes up, it's going to be really hard to vote yes on that one. I know it would be just mean if we all voted no and didn't allow you to retire, but darn it, you're making that a hard vote, Pam.
30 more years.
There you go.
20? Or 20? 15? 10? 10? I won't go any lower. Awesome.
Well, normally this room would be packed, and I wish it was, because there's a lot of people that would love to say some really great things. It's a little awkward saying
is.
it
It's-
when everybody's 10 feet
I
apart,
know.
and there's only a few of us allowed to be in here at a time, so. Sorry that puts a damper on things.
Sure. Well, first of all, just thank you very much. Thank you, Leslie, for your kind words. Commissioners, thank you for your support, and just, I really appreciate the words of support. So 40 years, it seems like it flew by, but I didn't just land this job and just stay wherever I got put, because after I graduated from the University of Minnesota, I did have 2 other jobs first, and I stayed at those jobs for about 1 year to 2 years each. And I knew they weren't the right fit for me. So it wasn't just by happenstance I fall into a job and this is just where I'm going to land, because I did have 2 jobs that I said, these are not the right culture for me, the right business. So when I came here, this felt like the right place. And I always have appreciated all the opportunities I've had for growth. So in 40 years, how can one person do one job in 40 years? That's not what happened with me. So I was so fortunate, because when I was hired, as I mentioned earlier, with 3 of us in the department, I really was more of a generalist and had the opportunity to do a lot of everything in terms of being related to personnel work. And so that was a real blessing for me, because I grew up here and I learned from the bottom up. And so it's been since about approximately 1995 that I had the opportunity to move into the labor chair. And I love it. And people are shocked when I say that, because it is a hard job. It's a very challenging job. And so I don't know why I love it, but I love the relationship part. That's a huge piece of it for me. I really like working with all the unions and building relationships and hopefully trust with every individual that I come into contact with. I enjoy being at the labor table. I enjoy being the lead chair at the labor table. And I'm very familiar with policies and contracts and a broad scope of issues because of the opportunity to have grown up here. So what's most important to me is always relationships. And I like the personal contact. So going through the COVID pandemic has been a challenge for me, because I don't have that as much, and that's what I thrive on. But I've just really been blessed in my life overall, in my personal life. I had no idea my husband was coming today, Terry Johnson. Wonderful husband, fabulous father of 2. I had no idea he was coming. In fact, I'll share with you, I just picked him up from the hospital about a week ago. So he's supposed to really be staying home and not really be doing anything, which is very hard for him because he's super active and pretty gregarious kind of guy. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you. He encouraged me to do it. I told him Leslie called me Friday, and I told her I'd think about it. And I guess that was the hook. I should have said absolutely not, but I said I'd think about it, and the next thing is I'm here, and I had no idea Terry was showing, so thank you. Oh, that was your incentive. So I plan to be here for maybe another year. We talk about retirement. I don't have a date because I am passionate about what I do. It'll be bittersweet for me to leave. It'll be bittersweet because this is a family to me, and I just so enjoy all my relationships, whether it's within employee relations. Our department is wonderful. The employees are so dedicated in this org. And I've got so many friends. I wish there were more friends here. That's who I miss. I miss all the people I get to work with and serve every day. So I really miss that during the pandemic. So, but for those of you who are here today, and I know it's very limited, thank you. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you. Thank you.
So we might have to check the tape, but I think I heard another 5 years.
I have
Got
one,
it, I agree.
There was a little garble. There was a little garble.
I have one more question. So who has been here longer than you at this county yet? Is there anybody?
Barb Hegfers.
Oh, okay.
So Barb Hegfers at the library, who also, I think we had her or something for her 40th. And of course, when Gary retired, I believe he had just hit 40 or something like that. So it's very, very rare.
Oh, yeah, you don't want to go.
So you
yeah,
gotta get her
yeah,
out here.
Yeah, you want to.
And for the staff that are here, there's some cake next door, and socially distance and kind of come through. Pam will be over there and congratulate her and thank you. Thanks again, Pam, for all you've done for the county.
Life well lived. Thank you. Oh, now we got to go back to the, okay. Yeah, this does feel a little awkward in these times when such a,
Darn it.
thank you for coming. Normally it would be a much different type of celebration, but it's a crazy world we're living in. There we go. I don't know if that got picked up. I don't know if that gets picked up on there, but nice applause out in the socially distanced hallway. All right, with that was awesome. There are some really great people in the county, and we're grateful for that. So we're going to move on to item number 5, which is the consent agenda. These are a number of items that I will read through, and they will pass with one motion. They've gone through our staff, and no surprises. So let me just get started with 5.1. Approve the renewal application for a precious metal license for Excel Pawn and Jewelry for 2020. 5.2, approve the renewal application for a 3.2% malt liquor license for JCI Shakopee in Louisville Township for 2020. 5.3, approve the renewal application for optional liquor sales until 2 a.m. for SSK Group, LLC, DBA Doherty's Tavern in Spring Lake Township. 5.4, approve the request for a conditional use permit amendment for the operation of an excavating company, Final Grade Inc., to expand the outside storage area and permit recycling of concrete and asphalt material in the I-1 zoning district. RJ Property Holdings LLC, applicant and property owners, and that's in the section 4 of Sand Creek Township. 5.5, approve payroll processing of personnel actions. 5.6, adopt resolution number 2020-101, accepting grant funding and authorizing execution of grant agreement numbers SG-11375, SG-12270, and SG-12283 with the Metropolitan Council for regional park projects in the amount of $789,469.57. 5.7, adopt resolution number 2020-102, approving a contract increase of $5,974.50 to Sunram Construction, Inc. for the Sand Creek Near Channel Sediment Reduction Phase 4 project in Helena Township. 5.8, adopt resolution number 2020-103, authorizing entering into a cooperative agreement with the City of Shakopee for turn lanes at the County Highway 78 and Zumbro Avenue intersection. 5.9, adopt resolution number 2020-105, authorizing a contract increase to the construction contract with Valley Paving, Inc. for the 2020 Overlays project. 5.10, approve the appointments of Steve Pawnee and Frank Boyles of Commissioner District 4 to the Prior Lake Spring Lake Watershed District Board of Managers. 5.11, approve the appointment of Ann Thorson of Commissioner District 2 to the Extension Committee. 5.12, adopt resolution number 2020-100, authorizing entering into an agreement with Canterbury Development LLC, granting the county an easement for sign purposes for relocation of a dynamic message sign along Shenandoah Drive. Those are the 12 items on consent. Is there any of those that you would like pulled to be discussed or presented?
Mr. Chair, I'll move approval of the consent agenda.
Second?
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll look to Deb for a roll call vote, please.
Commissioner Weckman-Brecky.
Aye.
Commissioner Wolf.
Aye.
Commissioner Beard.
Aye.
Commissioner Beer.
Aye.
Commissioner Ulrich.
All right, consent agenda passes. Now we're going to move to item 6.1 and receive a presentation from our folks, our friends at MICA. Come on in, we'll move some people around so you can be safe in our chambers here. Good morning.
Good morning, Commissioners. I'm going to find this easier to talk if you don't
Absolutely.
mind while I'm at the podium.
Take it off.
So good morning, Matt Mossman, Executive Director of the Minnesota Inter-County Association. Let's see what I have here. Is this just going to scroll with the page down?
Oh, it'll
I
look.
bet it will.
Yep.
There we go.
There you go.
So I want to get started. First of all, just start with thanking Commissioner Ulrich and Commissioner Beard, and certainly Administrator Vermillion for all your great support and work of MICA over the years and during the course of the last year. I think it is relevant to start off with just a little bit of context for this legislative session. I know that you have a lot of experience, but and we'll try and go fast, but on the screen, just real quickly, this session started off, it's the second year of the biennium, so a biennial budget was already in place. Started off on February 11th with a planned early committee deadlines and a planned spring recess for the April 5th to the 12th. Bonding was the only agreed upon common theme among the majority in the House, majority Democrats in the House and majority Republicans in the Senate and the governor as something that needed to happen. There was a small positive projected state budget balance that framed some tax cut proposals on the part of the Senate majority and some supplemental budget changes around child care and early childhood education and a large bonding bill on the House side. And very quickly, as we were moving through a frenetic pace of committee hearings and a full schedule for the week of March 16th, on March 9th, they're slowly but very bipartisanly and quickly expedited move through the legislature. The first, a $20.9 million, $21 million preparedness response funding package. On March 13th, the governor declared the peacetime emergency, and by the evening of March 15th and then the morning announced on March 16th, the legislature abruptly canceled all hearings and announced that they would be meeting on a by alternative means and on an on-call basis. And really, I label it here the unprecedented session because a lot that has followed has been extremely unusual, particularly in this line of work where you, as you all know, you meet people in the hallways and you build relationships, and it really shifted not only the focus entirely of the legislative session, but the way that work gets done. And for Micah, and the work that and value we hopefully we brought to you, it also meant that counties as well, county boards and county administrations also really were on the ground trying to give a meaning to what by alternative means was going to mean here during the COVID pandemic. So one of the things we did, the legislature obviously then met intermittently through the end of March, April, and into May. The agenda was almost exclusively, but certainly largely limited to COVID response legislation that was agreed upon by all four caucus leaders before something came to the floor, so that floor sessions could be limited. There were new voting procedures on the floor. There was no physical access to the Capitol or legislative offices. At least it was highly discouraged. You were probably being an anti-lobbyist if you ventured into those spaces, making your case more difficult. And certainly new protocols that eventually came into play for remote hearing. It took a while for all of that to get up to speed, but really changed the nature of the work and the nature of the agenda. In terms of the nature of the work, I want to call attention here to this slide to one of the things that I hopefully Administrator Vermillion and all of your staff teams who have been incredibly helpful to work with and really pleasant to work with. Really bright people came to the table, I know, to help all of you, but one of the things that I think goes untalked about sometimes in these presentations and really came to the fore during this situation are the staff groups that Micah facilitates. And I just put them up here on the screen on the bottom of this page that shows you the monthly staff groups that meet regularly, and then a couple that we organize periodically depending upon issues and in preparation for legislative session. But I think those staff groups during the month of March and April in particular in this situation, I know I met with your human resource directors and the human resource directors from the Micah counties almost on a weekly basis as we tried to sort out implications of the federal Family First Corona Relief Act, and then later some other legislation, the executive orders, how you were all going to move to your remote work and giving them an opportunity to learn and support each other during that process, as well obviously to identify how the COVID pandemic was changing what your agenda and needs were from the legislature in terms of urgent legislative action and temporary flexibilities. Nancy, among those key county provisions then that came out of that work, that were really, this page kind of focuses on the pandemic itself and things that happened. Nancy will touch base more, but certainly early work around funding for public health, flexibility for human service programs, work to ensure that public meetings like these could continue remotely and in compliance with state open meeting laws. There was work around temporary extension of driver's licenses and other deadlines that facilitated not only economic activity, but your work here, temporarily allowing the work of marriage licenses and other licensing work to happen electronically and avoid the need for wet signatures to continue processing. And really, then election law changes also that happened that were approved during regular session to give your election officials some opportunity to get a head start and access a significant amount of both state and federal money to ensure that primary and general elections can happen effectively here in the fall, late summer and fall. So, getting back to the good stuff, the big picture stuff, if you will. As the May 18th regular session adjournment got closer, what we saw is that the sort of original agenda from legislative session tended to return to the conversation a bit, with the emergence of one really significant piece, and that was with the passage of the Federal CARES Act, which, as you know, was a $2.2 trillion package that included a lot of different revenue streams to support both private businesses and individuals, as well as work that is done by state and local governments. But one piece of that was the $150 billion CARES stabilization funding, of which $2.2 billion came to Minnesota. And so by late April, that had emerged. Certainly I had identified as one of Micah's top priorities to make sure that we got a good outcome in that regard. As you know, however, with the convergence of all of those issues, really nothing happened. The May 18th session came to an end with very little of the big items, either CARES Act distribution, bonding, supplemental budget, a tax bill, none of those things getting over the finish line. And we'll talk, everyone here in our team will touch a bit more on those as we go forward. I just want to stop here, and then this is the one slide that I have that covers the CARES Act. As you know, the CARES Act distribution to local governments also did not get over the finish line during special session, but what did happen, fortunately, I hope as a result of both our lobby efforts as well as those of our partners, both heavily during the month of May and after regular session came to an end, a legislative compromise, bipartisan compromise did emerge leading up to the special session that kicked off on June 12th. But it didn't get over the finish line, but did end up framing the governor's executive action that followed on June 25th. So recapping, the long and short of it, as you can see from the top of the slide, it means a little north of $17.7 million for Scott County. That comes from the $2.187 billion that came to Minnesota. We had initially pushed for 60% of $667 million. One of the things that changed the dynamic of the conversation was federal guidance that came out in late May that seemed to indicate that the 45% number that was available for local governments was more like $841 million, which helped. There's some dispute as to whether that was the right number, but it did break the logjam nonetheless here in Minnesota. And so $841.5 million, of which 55% is going to the 85 counties that did not receive a direct appropriation. We expect DOR will begin distributing the funds this week and be in the hands of the counties and other local governments that have already signed the required certifications. And the funds are for necessary expenses incurred from March 1st through December 30th of this year that are due to COVID-19 and were unplanned expenses in the most recently adopted budget. And there's really two caveats to that, meaning expenses either cannot be lawfully paid from the budget line or And I really struggle to emphasize the or to everybody, or the expenses are for a substantially different use than the use that was planned. Because for, I think, most counties and most of these funds, that is the context under which most of the uses will be found to be eligible. Cannot be used to replace lost revenues, and the state expects the funds to cover, just one caveat that the state added, these things at this bottom bullet were all pieces of the conversation during legislative session as to how these would be funded. They had their separate funding conversations going on, and they've been folded into this. The state does expect that these funds will be used to cover any COVID-related FEMA matches, workers' compensation costs that might result from COVID-19, and otherwise unfunded public health response costs of county governments. There is a lot, that's the high level. As Administrator Vermillion knows, we are continuing to work with the state, with the federal government, with others. There's a lot of definition that still needs to happen around the U.S. Treasury guidance, which is still very broad because, frankly, the uses of this money are pretty broad. And so we'll continue to work with all of you on helping define that so that you can make good use of that $17 million. I'm going to pause and turn it over to Nancy Selesky, who does Health and Human Services and Public Health for us. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. I'm Nancy Selesky, and as Matt indicated, I cover Public Health and Human Services for MICA. And it's a pleasure to be here this morning. So we were clicking along, I think, as the world was until COVID hit. All things considered, I would say we did fairly well in the Health and Human Services arena. The Health and Human Services Policy Bill was one of the bills that got hung up at the end of the regular session as well. We were watching the clock tick toward midnight going, oh my gosh, we're not going to get to it. And there was, frankly, a lot in that bill that we needed to see get done. So that bill did get brought up again during the regular session, or excuse me, the special session, and they had removed some controversial language related to DHS powers. That's kind of what hung it up at the end of the session. So in the special session, that language was removed from the bill, and a couple of our priorities were included in the Omnibus Health and Human Services Policy Bill. One was a Birth to 8 collaborative, which focuses on children during the first 8 years of their life to make sure that they're ready for school, they're able to read, and basically succeed in life. That bill passed a number of years ago, but we found that there was some language that needed to be tweaked. And so we had hoped to carry that as a standalone bill, but when COVID happened, it ended up getting rolled into this larger bill, and that did pass and was signed into law by the governor. Another piece was the Yellow Line Jail Diversion Project. I think you've all probably heard of that. It started in Blue Earth County, but it's basically a situation where an officer may pick somebody up that has either a mental health issue or a substance abuse or substance use issue and arrest them, bringing them into the jail. What's happening is a social worker is actually embedded at the pre-booking site, and with the agreement of law enforcement, they try to establish a plan for that person rather than putting them in a jail cell. That bill did pass in 2016, but there were some tweaks that needed also to be changed there at CMS's request, so that was also included in that bill. One of the controversial things I just mentioned about the first version of the policy bill dealt with DHS and the waivers that they've granted. And so they took they separated that issue from the HHS policy bill and did a separate bill. And as you all know, since COVID, all of us are working much differently. And as a result, DHS has issued, I think, about 65 waivers allowing counties and other organizations to work differently. Our concern was what happens at the end of the peacetime emergency. We can't just flip the switch and say, okay, go back to how things were. It's going to take some time. So we put together a list, and it actually generated with counties. AMC put together a blue ribbon commission that was comprised of 15 commissioners, 5 of which were MICA commissioners. I just want to mention them. It was Commissioners Cascaden, Phoebe, Landcamer, Rogness, and Slawick. And they kind of went through all of those waivers and said, hey, what's working and maybe what isn't, and came up with a list. And we started the list, DHS took it, legislators took it and kind of tweaked it, but I would say that the counties led on this for sure. So as soon as that peacetime emergency is over, all waivers will remain in effect for 60 days, a minimum of 60 days. And then they went through again and came up with about a dozen, maybe 15, that will extend actually until June of next year, 2021. And that will allow the legislature then to make the decision as to whether these are good things, rather than putting all of the control into the administration, which was some of the pushback, frankly, from the legislature. Some of those things I'll just mention, a lot of telemedicine, a lot of tele-everything we're calling it. We're using it for waiver programs, school-linked mental health, targeted case management, health care, mental health care, substance use care. A lot of uses for telehealth. So that, again, is in effect until June of 2021. There were also some modifications to licensing requirements related to mental health and substance use. We did get language that partially waives county costs related to delayed discharges at the Anoka Metropolitan Regional Treatment Center or a CBHH hospital if the delay is due to the person having COVID. We're getting some relief from having to pay those full costs for that. And then there was language that basically provides temporary absence for people that are getting public housing support. If they need to be away from their home, where they're living for a period of time due to COVID, this allows that to happen. Other things were flexibilities relating to personal care assistance and community-based waiver services, as well as allowing for telemedicine for assessments and consultations in the medical cannabis program. So those were the things that came out. There were a couple things that we would have liked to have seen. They were in the child protection area, and the legislature just didn't want to go there at this point. But those were the ones that we have for now. Some talk about whether there might be a few more flexibilities discussed when they start the second special session, which we are hearing will be on Monday. But do have a call with a couple of the chairs this afternoon, and we'll see where we go with that. Another bill that passed provides a rate increase for providers who care for low-income children in the Ccap program. And this basically brings Minnesota into federal compliance and frees up some federal funds that need to be spent within the next 3 years. And any cost related to that is coming through a surplus of the federal child care development block grant funds. So that also was signed into law. In terms of public health, T21, you all saw that. That passed and was signed by the governor. This covers tobacco, e-cigarettes, anything related to nicotine products. You need to be 21 now to purchase. It also, the legislation also expanded the prevention of tobacco use in charter schools. Previously, it had just been the public schools. Other things, Matt mentioned the public health response contingency account that was created early in March, and that was almost $21 million. $8.5 million of that did go to local public health. And then there was a second bill that went into effect. They put more money into that account, $50 million that goes to the Department of Health for response activities related to COVID. In addition, $150 million went into a healthcare response fund, and this will allow the making of grants to eligible providers for costs relating to COVID, and funding the establishment and operation of temporary sites to provide testing, as well as to provide treatment beds and space for isolation and quarantine of affected individuals. And that also was signed by the governor in March. Just want to mention a couple of things. We always have to talk about what didn't happen. Governor's supplemental budget did not happen. Late in the end of the first special session, the House tried to attach some of that language to the CARES funding bill. Senate did not want that. That did not happen. I don't know whether we're going to see a supplemental budget bill in the next session or not. The jury's out there. One thing I just wanted to mention is contained within that was the $8 million to reimburse counties for the IMD services, for the overpayment of IMD services. So that we're watching for. There was also one-time grants for MFIP recipients of $500. And then one thing I do want to mention that has risen to the surface lately is there's about a $38 million operating deficit relative to the direct care and treatment facilities, Anoka, CBHH, et cetera. So we're not certain what the legislature is going to do about that. I know when they were working on at the end of the last session, they were dealing with about $58 million that was available, and this is $38 million. And so I'm certain they're not going to get the entire thing, but this could create problems for counties in terms of placing people. So we're watching that very carefully. Another thing I wanted to mention that involves Scott County is we partnered with Beacon Interfaith Housing early in the session to try and expand the Metro Demo Housing Support Program. Clicking along famously again, moving through the House process, had a hearing scheduled in the Senate. COVID happened and it kind of came to a screeching halt. But that legislation, which I'm assuming we will continue to look at for next year, it would have added 424 beds, and then it would have added Scott, Carver, and Washington counties to that program. So we'll be working on that. Another issue that we got introduced and we're hopeful for was it would have provided for a limited exception for immediate face-to-face visits with children in the child protection system in some certain cases. The immediate means within 24 hours, and there would have been some exception for kids that were, there's a law enforcement investigation going on as an example, and or the child was in no danger of having any contact with the alleged offender. So very limited, and then under those limited situations, we would have had 5 days to respond. Again, introduced by Senator Ralph in the Senate and Representative Pinto and Krisha in the House. And we'll come back on that one again next year. Do want to mention that was one of the child protection or one of the waivers that we were looking at that the legislature just was not ready to deal with. So we'll talk with them more about that next year. And then broadband. Senate passed it overwhelmingly in both the regular session and special session, and the House just didn't get to it. We just want to mention one part of it. Within that broadband bill, there was $2 million for new telemedicine equipment, and local public health and county boards were eligible to apply for those grants. And some of the scenarios that I've been told that people were thinking of for those folks that didn't have, an iPad or an iPhone or, any technology whatsoever for these visits that counties are provided or required to provide. So I know that they want to get that done. I don't know whether that will be part of Monday's special session agenda or not. In addition to that $2 million, there was $15 million for distance learning and another $10 million for the border-to-border broadband grant program. And the last thing I'm just going to mention is there's a lot of talk, as we all know, about DHS and some of the issues that are there. I'm trying to think what month it was probably in April. We've been working with actually Senator Draheim, and he visited your county. Just what can be done. Everybody seems to recognize that counties do all the work, but what can we do to put some efficiencies in place? He introduced a bill along with Senator Rosen that we brought to them. Matt drafted this language, and it had to do with creating a Human Services Transformation Commission. And the idea was, what are the long-range transformational goals with this department? How can it be more efficient, and how can it work better with us? And so we got that legislation introduced. Some of the things that we've been advocating, as you know, for a long time is simplification of these complex programs that we run. Improving the use of data and data sharing, that always seems to be a problem at the legislature. Looking at other states' best practices, and also convening a panel of both private and non-private, both private and public and nonprofit sectors, I should say, to advise this group. It was introduced, again, I don't mean to use COVID as an excuse, but it's true. We intend to look at this over the interim, and we've talked with Senator Abler about it. Perhaps there could be an interim hearing. We haven't arranged for that yet, but we're working on that. And then I know Representative Liebling was interested in talking about it at some point too, but this was just not the year for it. With that, I would finish up and say, like I said, all things considered, it was a good year. I do want to do a shout out to your folks. Pam Selvig, who's here, is very much a participant in all of our groups, and we look to her for her expertise often, as well as Lisa Brodsky in public health. We work with them very, very closely, and I just want to make sure that you all realize how wonderful they are.
Awesome, thank you very much.
Thank
Looking to
you.
my left, because I think we have some questions.
Oh.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. Nancy, it's
Sure.
good to see you again.
Thank you.
I miss seeing all the Micah guys in public, or in person,
We do too.
instead of just on the computer screen. Thanks for coming out. Hey, we've had some attention paid lately to our work programs for developmentally disabled and so on. There seems to be some real financial turbulence and trouble going on there. Was that what was tied up in that 38 million you were talking about a few minutes ago, or is that a separate issue? And what's going to happen in the special session about it?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Beard, that was not part of the discussion, but Senator Abler has a bill that he was pushing, and it was actually heard during the special session, didn't get off the ground in the House. There's language in that bill that provides for like 50% grants for those facilities to keep them open. But presumably, I mean, that's all going to have to come from CARES dollars. I'm guessing that would be eligible. I'm going to look to Matt. I mean, I think I'm thinking that that would be eligible within the individual communities but they did not pass a separate funding bill for that.
They
We
did
talked
not.
about it.
And just briefly help me understand how we got in this situation. Was it because of the loss of revenue from their business streams because of the COVID-19 deal, or?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner, that's my
That's it.
understanding. They're just not able to keep their doors open without some help. There was a hearing last week that Senator Abler had, and it's grim. I mean, there are many that have suggested that they may have to close their doors.
I know MRSI has had some issues here in Shakopee as well, I guess. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair. Hi, Nancy. Good to see you. I just want to thank you for everything, but especially for the work on the waiver extensions. I think, obviously a challenging time, but it just kind of a reminder to us that we can always be doing this work, and a challenging time could yield better processes, better work for the future. It's not just about these waiver extensions. It's really looking at them, seeing if we need to change how we do this type of work in the future for the long term. So thank you, and I think we're going to be very interested in continuing to hear about that even after COVID, what changes should be made, can be made, what needs to go back to how it was before. I think it's a great opportunity that we need to make sure we're taking to make some progress on that. So thank you.
Thank you. Just to add to that, Mr. Chair and Commissioner, we've been told that we're going into a deficit next year. We've got to find different and better ways to work. And so I think they're open to this. This telemedicine thing is clearly state of the art. One concern I should bring up is I think there's some concern about the capacity of the system at some point. I mean, there are areas of the state where capacity is increased like over 1,000% because that's how we're delivering services. So I think we're going to see this continue. So yeah, and we're innovative. We'll do it.
Thank you.
Well, you may have answered my question there, because part of it was, because you're down into the soup on a regular basis. Are those waiver extensions, I'm going to look to you too to answer this, are they roundly or mostly roundly accepted in St. Paul? Most of these, kind of looking at Pam, I'm looking at, because I know we hear about it, we hear about things, the efficiencies, and okay, there's a deficit next year, so that might force, but is there, sometimes folks don't like to give up control, and I'm not saying that's happening, but I suspect part of it is that. How open is St. Paul on many of these waivers, not just some, in your opinion?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I think, we put together quite a laundry list and they rejected some. I mean, it depends on the service. Again, child protection is not an area that people, take lightly, that we need to have those face-to-face visits as quickly as we can. But on the ones that make sense, it has unanimous support from both sides of the aisle. I mean, we worked with your legislators out here. Tony Albright was very much part of the discussion, and I think everyone recognizes what counties do, or they say they do, and understand that we are the deliverer of the services, and they seem to be very open and receptive to that. And frankly, like I said, we're going to be looking at cuts next year in some areas, so we're going to have to find ways to work more efficiently.
And just to follow up to that, you mentioned they say that they acknowledge that the counties are deliverers. Are they generally open and willing to be willing and hear from our folks, you know, our county, but also the other 86 that are out in the field doing it and valuing that input?
Mr. Chair, I would say yes.
Okay.
They look to counties a lot. I mean, almost every conversation we have with the legislators, we love our counties. What can we do? And the criticism where there is in this system is generally at the department and being a block sometimes for things that we want to do. So
Yeah.
we just need to continue with that.
Got to keep pushing, and I think my last question is going back to DHS. You know, news cycles, world events, pandemics have a way of shifting focus and shining light on different things, rightfully so. You had mentioned DHS. Well, we all know that early on they were looking at maybe splitting that up, and because of some things that happened. Now that money is being, back in the semi-old days, you could just print it. Right now you can digitally deliver dollars. How is the accountability? Is there still folks that have eyes on that on a pretty regular basis? And are those discussions still moving forward on, do they break up, do they not? Like, where's that? Because I haven't heard much of that because I've been dealing with other things.
Mr. Chair, Senator Draheim, who I mentioned earlier,
Yep.
and who visited your county, was really looking at, how do we hold this department accountable? And he did have legislation that would have created basically another agency,
Right,
but didn't want to
yeah.
put any more money or any full-time employees into it. So how that would have, fleshed out, I'm not sure. But I would say the new commissioner is on good footing. I mean, she kind of came in and said, hey, I have a 60-day plan and I'm going to make some changes here. I think she's respected, but it's just such a huge agency, and it's so unwieldy, and it just seems like you read about something just about every day or something else that came up. But I would say that yes, they want to look at that, but breaking up the agency, I'm not certain that that's
And I'm
the
not
way to
promoting
go.
any certain way. I just, so when you mentioned Graham's bill on efficiencies, that includes accountability in that same language.
correct. There were
Okay.
penalties, in fact, that if they didn't correct them within a period of time, they were going to be assessed penalties. And
Yeah, okay.
so more to come on it, I would say.
I was just curious since we
Yeah.
had you here and, we've
Sure.
just been dealing with other things, so it was just more of a curiosity question.
Can I ask one question?
Absolutely.
Mr. Chair. So they forecast the budget deficit at about 2.5 billion about months.
Is that it? Is that the number?
Oh, boy.
Let's see.
Uh-oh.
I just want to find out what that new
Trying to read that face, what does that mean?
crazy number is.
Put your
Okay.
mask on now.
Yeah,
So you
right.
can't read.
Right, yeah, there was a benefits. Yeah.
I'll wait.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. It's always good to be in Scott County.
Nice.
That's what we
And
say.
it's a little frustrating giving a transportation report at this moment in time because there's not a whole lot that's been accomplished in law. Saying that, there's been a lot of activity that has gone on, and there is hope. Normally, I tell you what happened, and then at the end, I tell you what didn't happen. In transportation this year, for the purposes of this meeting, I'm gonna do it in reverse and just simply say that about 95% of what we're trying to accomplish in transportation this year would be inside the bonding bill, which is normally the main piece of work in the shorter, even year session. And we've yet to pass a bonding bill in the regular session or the first special session. So the list of what did not happen includes most of Micah's transportation top priorities. There is no local road bonding money, no local bridge bonding money, no money for the local road wetland replacement program, no Greater Minnesota or Metropolitan Transit money, no port development, no rail service development, no bus rapid transit. So, saying that, let me move on to something more positive, which is the way this thing is setting up for the second special session, which I think was announced this morning, or at least the scuttlebutt is so strong that we think it will happen next Monday. And there seems to be, finally now, as we reach the second special session, a consensus growing in both parties that they got to get this bonding bill done for a variety of reasons, and we certainly hope that'll be the case. The reason I have slightly more than cautious optimism about the bonding bill is the fact that from the very beginning of the session, right up until this point in time, when you talk to the caucus leaders, when you talk to all the members, basically everybody wants to get a bonding bill done. And transportation is really the top priority on the Senate side, and it's certainly in the top 2 or 3 on the House side. And so I think what we want to look at is those categories of specialty issues that we spent a year working on. Actually, we spent years working on them. And take a look at how they sit in the House bill and the Senate bill. And I think you already know, but just as a reminder, what makes the bonding bill more complicated than other normal pieces of legislation is under the Constitution, you have to have a 60% vote. And we have a unique situation based on the numbers now where the House is DFL, but to get to 60%, you need 6 Republican House members. On the Senate side, which is Republican, you have the same situation. For them to get to 60%, they need 6 DFL minority members. And so that's created a lot of intrigue, as it always does. We've got caucus leaders who are pretty interesting personalities, and they're all in play. Commissioner Beard can tell you all about it. He used to be one of those people, as you know. So let me just take you through the list and remind you that our 3 top priorities for the legislative session in terms of MICA was the local road wetland mitigation issue. And the governor, he was the first one out of the gate with his bill back in January. But of course, these bills are written and passed by the House and the Senate, and then in the end, he can sign them or not. But he sets a guideline, and in all these major categories, his guideline matched the MICA recommendation. So that was a nice starting point. But the proof is in the pudding, and that's the House and the Senate, and so here we go. On the local road wetland mitigation issue, the House is in at $15 million in bonding and $8 million cash. The Senate is in at $18 million in bonding and no cash. And it's also interesting to keep in mind as you listen to these numbers that the House bill is substantially larger than the Senate bill overall. But there are actually categories of transportation funding where the Senate is bigger than the House. So it's another piece of evidence that the Senate views transportation infrastructure bonding as a priority, which should give us all some hope here. The local bridge program, we were all hoping for something in the 100 million plus category, and both the House and the Senate are sort of loosely fitting in that area. On the House side, the bill is $53.2 million in general competitive bonding money for local bridges, local meaning county bridges, and $50 million set aside for the St. Paul Kellogg Avenue Bridge, which is the huge project in St. Paul. That's matched up against $25 million in the Senate for general bridge bonding, and they also have $50 million for the St. Paul Kellogg Avenue Bridge. So that shows you that that is clearly a priority of the policymakers. Then down to local road improvement, your local roads. Again, the governor was where we were at 100 million, and the House is at 53.2. The Senate is at a higher number, 80 million, but then the House adds to it a number of local projects that when you add them up would bring them at about $100 million. One of those local projects is Scott County Trunk Highway 13 and the Dakota Interchange. And I think it's an important one to note because my feeling about it is going into next week that the projects that are going to really be in play, and there's a lot of them, are going to be projects where both the House and Senate have got money in their column for those projects. There are a number of other projects, and you have one. The Shakopee US 169 pedestrian and bike overpass, where there's $2.1 million on the House side but zero in the Senate. And you can hope and work on that, and we will, but probably the higher probability are these local projects where there's already money in the House and Senate bills, but not the same number, so you have to be negotiated. So anyway, there's a number of those. And then we go on to other categories of not just interest in transportation, but they are also our MICA platform planks that you all participated in. Under port development, the House has $14 million, the Senate has $3 million. Under Minnesota rail service improvements, the House has $6 million, the Senate has $3 million. Under railroad warning signal replacements, House has $5 million, Senate has $1 million. Under the Transportation Economic Development Program, the so-called TED program, the House is in at $3 million, the Senate's in at $1.5 million. So I think that the reason for my optimism is, in order to get a deal here, I think the Senate Republicans are going to have to bring up the overall number of their bonding bill. And I don't know what that will be, but I think we will see some movement in that area. And then hopefully, negotiations going the way they should. You've got two different numbers that are not the same. You start searching for the middle. And my point would be that if we find the middle between these House and Senate positions on these major transportation issues, and they pass it into law with a 60% vote, we're going to talk about it as a very significant transportation bonding bill as compared to the last 10 or 15 years of history in Minnesota. And so it's another way of saying it's worth working on. There's progress to be made here between these two columns. And I think we can take some hope that everything they've said for 6 months is not totally in vain, that they do really want to get a bonding bill. And if we get a bonding bill, there will be a substantial transportation component to it. So I would leave the bonding discussion there for now. And then just shift briefly to transportation policy issues. This was another significant area of mostly non-activity. Because they put a criteria in once the COVID-19 hit that they weren't going to entertain any policy bills that all four caucus leaders didn't agree to. And since the House and Senate majority caucuses view things pretty differently, there weren't a lot of issues that fell into that category, but 3 of them did pass. One was substantial, and it was actually back before COVID-19 took over the world here. And that was the Nicollet to New Ulm Trunk Highway 14. If you followed transportation, Chairman Beard would know all about this one, as most of us do too, including yourselves, I'm sure. But anyway, working with MnDOT and all those interests, they managed to get this project to be considered by the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, the Federal Act of 1998, which we think is going to produce a lot of money for this project, enough so that it can be taken off our books, which opens up a lot of money for other projects around the state, which is one amongst many reasons why that bill passed with a big bipartisan vote back in March, I believe it was. And then a little bill on various types of motor vehicle and driver provisions. And then another bill on replacement license plate fees and enhanced driver's license and enhanced identification cards. And then I'll just conclude by saying that transportation, again, has been a bit of the weak sister on the federal side as it relates to COVID-19. I mean, Nancy gave a great report on all this money that has been coming into Minnesota for related issues to that subject area. We've had conversation on the federal side. We now have a big bill introduced on the House side that is either just passed or is about to pass, but it's quite different from the Senate approach in Congress, so it may never make it. So we haven't had any real help there either, but we do finally have some movement. And Secretary Chow and the Trump administration, they've come out with a $906 million infrastructure bill, which has some substantial transportation money in it that hopefully could find its way to Minnesota. But I think our future, the immediate future, the next 6 months to a year, rests in this bonding bill in the hope that special session number 2 will produce the result we need. And I do believe quite strongly that if you read that we passed a bonding bill, it will have a substantial transportation component in it. It will actually directly address all of Micah's transportation priorities to some significant degree. So I would stop there and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much.
So I'll try and wrap up quickly. Carly Stark is not able to be with us today. She is on staff at AMC, and then we contract with her to cover public safety corrections issues. Again, this is another place where the biggest thing that we were asking for was a supplemental budget piece down at the bottom of this page to increase funding for Community Corrections Act counties and county probation office and probation services. The governor proposed money for that area. There's bipartisan legislative leadership on the bill to do that. It was heard and given positive attention by the chairs in both the House and the Senate. And a supplemental bill just hasn't come to pass yet. It was in the conversation on Friday of the last day of special session number 1. So we're hopeful that there's still some possibility of that happening if a supplemental budget passes. But that was the biggest thing. There are other disasters that can happen. There are some actual natural disasters that come about. At the beginning of the session, the state disaster contingency account was actually negative $3 million, was flat out of money. The legislature did put $30 million into that to cover state and the local match needs of federal and state disasters. So we're prepared for that. There's a change that's going to affect your law enforcement officers on an expedited a pathway here to the post board is directed through a policy bill to come up with consistent guidelines on eyewitness identification process, and then the chief law enforcement officer of all law enforcement agencies in the state will have a limited amount of time to put something in place on that. It's just don't know if you've had issues here or not in Scott County, but that's one thing that's going on. There's also some language that passed around DOC contracts as part of the COVID situation. There has been some conversation about inmates in the state prison system who were very quickly, I guess no more quickly than time passes, but approaching their last 90 days of their sentence, which is when they start preparing for release anyhow of those inmates, and there was conversation about releasing them early to support social distancing or having them finish their last 90 days of their sentence in county facilities. The one really important thing here that was good for counties was that it was written in a way instead of counties couldn't be forced to do it. There was a contract needed to be negotiated between the counties and the state for the per diem and the covering of the costs of those. So counties would have some seat at the table in terms of making sure their costs were covered. So that, I think, satisfied our needs. Some other things that started that were big issues at the front of session. The 5-year probation cap that the Sentencing Commission put in place was not rejected by the legislature. Forfeiture reform, and of course, in the last couple weeks here, which will continue to be part of driving the agenda and conversation, law enforcement accountability reforms did not happen. So I said I was going to close with the state budget. All in all, I think if a bonding bill could pass, and especially if a bonding bill and a small supplemental budget bill did happen to pass in the next couple days, all things being relative, it would actually have been a pretty good session for counties. Hopefully, unless I hear differently from you with the CARES Act distribution money now happening with regard to the pandemic, which is driving everyone's agendas in a large way, that most of the needs of counties will hopefully be covered by that resource. But the horizon, also related to COVID, obviously, in terms of the economic impacts and the public budget impacts that will follow, is not looking too good. And so that, as we think about the next legislative session and finishing up this calendar year, is something that we want to start preparing for. Here on the screen, what you have is just the summary all the way going back to the February state budget forecast, which showed a $1.5 billion surplus at that time, or I should say positive balance, and $824 million ongoing in the tails, so more one-time money than ongoing money. Early in session, the legislature passed a total of about $550 million worth of COVID response related items. All of those were one time. And then with the just dramatic fall off in what economists were predicting and what the state economic consultants were projecting for economic changes in economic growth in just the 3 weeks or 4 weeks that followed the data upon which the February forecast was based and how dramatically it changed. Minnesota Management and Budget took steps to do something that hasn't, I don't think, been done in the 40-year history or so of the state having formal budget forecasts, and that is they did some revisions in terms of projections. It wasn't not a full forecast, but nonetheless, those revisions, by just applying basically the new economic consultant predictions for GDP growth, or in this case, GDP decline, they used that new information to revise revenue projections and spending estimates. And so what we saw from that is an estimated drop that the state is estimating $3.6 billion drop. And I should call out that they only revised projections for 20 and 21. They did not venture into the tail period of 22 and 23. So just for 2021, they're assuming in the last 18 months that existed at the time they did those, or 14 months of the biennium, a $3.6 billion drop in state revenues, a slight up benefit or lower overall estimated spending, and that has largely to do with the fact that on a one-time basis, the federal government is increasing its share of medical assistance costs. So costs are actually going up because costs tend to be counter-cyclical in the human services area, but the federal government is paying more of those costs on a temporary basis, so it's going to save us a little money. And then some projected reserve changes. All in all, we flipped $4 billion as a part of from 1.5 billion positive to 2.4 billion negative. As you can see then in the middle of the page, things got pretty tight at the legislature, frankly, with everybody wanting to be very cautious about any additional spending changes that would happen. So very little during regular session and special session happened to change that. There was a small amount, I believe that might have been in, it wasn't in an ag bill. I believe that was, I'm not sure, I forget where that $2 million falls, but there was a slight spending someplace of $2 million. So currently things are about the same, $2.5 billion of projected deficit for this biennium, 2021. And I do want to call out that inflation, of course, is what you know is not built into the Minnesota state budget forecast. That estimate for the tails period is $1.1 billion. So a pretty bleak picture for 2021 and 22-23. Again, that I been watching the state budget, and that's where I cut my teeth, was doing state budget work, and I just think there is every reason to anticipate that it's going to get worse when a formal budget forecast comes out in November and then in February, for two reasons. The limited information, I think, even though as the economy reopens, but as we all know, struggles to reopen in a healthy way and sort of on a pathway that is certain to be sustainable. It's just not clear, and the economic consulting work that this forecast is based on assumed that we would have a downturn for a couple of quarters here in this calendar year, and then a quick rebound, for basically just a V. I don't think that is necessarily realistic anymore. It's going to be much more of a U-shaped GDP impact, which will slow things down. You also have the fact that the 22-23 period here has not been estimated, and it's going to be, whatever that economic growth is now going to be applied to a lower base of revenues, a lower economic base. So I think that there's significant reason to be concerned about what the state budget looked like, and then ultimately how it impacts the state. The reserves are healthy. As of right now, the 2.3 $2.4 billion in state general fund reserves, although again, it gets worse in the tails because the biennial budget that the state passed last year actually used $491 million that to balance things in the tails. So really there's about $1.8 billion out there. And as we talked about earlier, that second to the last line, the state got a total of $1.8 billion in CARES Act federal funding. 841 million of that went to local governments. The state has used some of it. There's only about 747 of that left. To the extent that that covers diverted costs, so state employees at the Department of Health, at the Department of Human Services, Corrections, Public Safety, other state agencies that are doing COVID-related work, just like payroll expenses here at the county level, some of those costs will be able to be covered by the CARES Act, so that will have some mitigating effect on the budget on a one-time basis as those expenses are redirected to federal funding sources instead of state funding sources. All in all, however, I was stretching to come up with the biggest potential ways that the state could help cover some of that known deficit already at this point, and that doesn't quite get there, and the potential and likelihood that it'll get worse. So that's about where we're at. It's bleak. Finally, there's other non-general funds that impact the work of local governments, and I just want to call out that those were revised also. So these are just some selected revenue change projections that were issued in May for the Transit Assistance Fund, which is about 90% goes to Metro Transit. So top line there, that fund is down about $117 million in revenue from what was projected in February. All of the constitutionally dedicated legacy funds, Parks and Trails, Arts and Cultural Heritage, Outdoor Heritage, Clean Water, of course, are down. And then down at the bottom, you can see that there was reductions in all of the highway user tax distribution fund revenues, which by my estimates and MMB documents is going to drop the CASA allocations by roughly 4% in terms of the amounts that will be distributed relative to the February forecast. So again, the 22-23 period was not re-estimated as part of these. This was just the fiscal year 2021 estimates. Happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you.
We are hoping for something next week, and so we'll see where it goes. Thank you for your support again of Micah.
Appreciate you coming out.
Any final questions? Comments?
Interesting to see what happens in the
Oh,
next one.
boy.
Oh, yeah, it's always interesting.
Always interesting. Thank you very much. We appreciate that presentation.
Mr. Chair, maybe one question for Matt on the way out the door. The governor's gonna call an emergency or declare an emergency again on Monday, which requires a special session. Any idea what he's thinking for the August? Is that too far out there yet?
I don't, but just knowing the governor a little bit and his team and the situation, and my experience in state government, I think that there are a lot of response activities right now that are based on sort of the continuation of the emergency powers being in place to sort of facilitate them with some ease. And so I would anticipate that as long as the pandemic is continuing nationally, that it will be extended again. That'd be my guess.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. All right. Give me a second to rejigger the screen. We're going to move on to item number 7.1 to adopt resolution number 2020-104, determining the Miriam Junction Sands LLC final environmental impact statement adequate and approving the record of decision. Good morning.
Hello, hello. Get my
stuff set up here. We're gonna swap out some folks to keep it socially distanced inside. Thanks for your patience, everybody.
Morning,
Morning.
Mr. Chair, Commissioners. I'm Jesse Krasinski with Scott County Environmental, and today we are here to determine the adequacy of the Merriam Junction Sands EIS. So I'll just kind of lay out general EIS process. I'm sure it's been a while, and then we'll just refresh the project a little bit. Keep it pretty general. I'm not going to go over to any technical things. It's just kind of quick refresher, just a reminder of
great.
all the workshops we did that did cover the technical.
We've covered all, yes, thanks for
And then
bringing that up.
I'll brush on some of the comments we received during the public comment period as well. So the EIS is a reminder, it is not a permit. It's typically just a tool used for those who will issue the final permits. So with the mining IUP, it'll be referenced for conditions and things like that. And then it's multiple phases. This particular one has been ongoing for 8 years now. So here are the gray boxes are those that we've already done. So this was kind of the EIS scoping phase, which mainly determines what we actually studied in the EIS. And then here are all the EIS stages, and I'll just kind of go over them quick. So you actually compile the EIS, a draft version. From there, it goes out to public comment. And during that public comment, you also hold a public meeting. And then once the public comment ends, you address all those comments and you incorporate them into the final EIS. And then the final EIS also has to be published and has its own comment period. And then once that's completed, we come to the step we're at now and we determine the adequacy. So the project, Merriam Junction Sands EIS, we have 682 acres of land in Louisville Township off of Highway 41 and 169. We have 2 separate owners and multiple parcels. We have Melkerson Sales to the west there, and then Bryan Rock Products to the east. It's an ongoing current mining operation, as well as a few other things like Renaissance Festival is on Melkerson Sales product and property. So the project itself is proposing to continue that mining operation as well as expanding into the production of silica sand. So on top of the construction aggregates that they already mine, the sand and gravel and limestone, they'd like to expand it to add the sandstone below that. So here's just kind of the current layout of the site, just so you can understand where the active mining currently is, and then how it associates with the other activities on the site, like the Renaissance Festival to the west there, and the stables to the north of Melkerson's area. So the actual mining, like I said, they're going to continue the construction aggregates as well as expanding into the silica sand. That process will require some dewatering. The base of that limestone layer that's right above the sand just has some unappreciable qualities that they don't want contaminating, so it has to be taken out with dry methods. So that way it just needs to be watered and then blasted and removed through dry. And then the sandstone 80 to 120 feet thick across the site will eventually be mined through wet techniques. So here's a concept plan. This is just kind of a good idea to understand post-reclamation, what you'd see with the end-use lakes mainly. Those are this is the good representation of this slide. The orange boxes are the septic sites that have been identified, so those will be protected for future development. But mainly those could change. This is just a concept idea. What's good to see here is the end-use lakes that wouldn't change. And this is a lot. Remember our last workshop, we covered all of these topics and any type of impact that could happen, and then any mitigation required. I'm not going to go over those again. I just wanted you to see how much is in the EIS, and it's just kind of good to see in this significant amount. So we drafted the EIS, and it was published on February 3rd. It gets published with the Minnesota EQB, and it also goes out to multiple state agencies and anybody that requests a copy, and then it gets posted on our website. And anybody can go and download and view it and send comments in. We then held a public meeting here, actually on February 25th. was fairly well attended. We had a couple comments from citizens at the meeting. After the public comment period, which ended March 10th, we had comments from 7 state agencies and 3 community members. The agencies were Department of Transportation, Pollution Control Agency, Department of Natural Resources, State Historic Preservation Office, the Met Council, Scott WMO, and Louisville Township. So those comments, I'm not going to go through all of them. They are included in the ROD if you wanted to look at all of them. Mainly just addressed water resources, air, noise, traffic. From there, we responded to everybody's comments, incorporated them into the final EIS. And so then we published that, and we sent out, actually, with the EIS, the final EIS, we actually put a document that had everybody's comments with our responses. They could see what we wrote. From there, we published the final EIS, which again incorporated those comments from the draft EIS public comment period. It started on June 1st is when we published it, and it went about 2 weeks to June 15th. We got 2 comments saying we have no comments from DNR and Met Council. And with that, nice and quick, staff is recommending that the EIS be deemed adequate today. And then I'm here for questions, and the proposers are here as well.
All right, we have a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jesse, you mentioned in your opening comments that this process has been going on for 8 years.
Correct.
Please tell me that some of that has been driven by the applicants taking the brick off the accelerator, so to speak, and not because we've been dragging it down from a regulatory side of things.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Commissioner, yes, it was kind of a agreed upon. Typically, they have a more strict timeline for these, but we had to get, I think, a waiver through the EQB to say that we can kind of drag it out. They submitted one section at a time, and then we would review it and provide comments, rather than getting the entire document, because that would have been just an incredible amount of work. So the way that we did it was one section at a time, and then we responded with our comments.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say thank you for being workable with citizens who are trying to do things with their land and their property. I'm aware, I'm sure we're all aware of the horror stories of what's going on up north, where there's a deliberate attempt to drag things out and break the bank, so to speak, on certain projects. 8 years, you can understand my concern when I heard that, because in one case it's been 11 years and $2 billion. So thank you. I just want to say thanks to the staff for working within the parameters of the program, but working with the applicant as well. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, Jesse, I think we've seen this, we're familiar with it. The applicant's been very involved with a lot of the agencies. I just want to clarify for the record, we heard that 2 of the agencies responded, no additional comments. Did we not hear from any of the others with the final publication?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner, yes, it was just the 2, and they said we have no comments. The DNR actually did say we feel that your responses were adequate to our original questions, but nobody else sent any comments of no comment either.
And the comment period was open. Meetings were held pre-COVID, so people have had the opportunity to speak up if need be. So that was not stymied by.
Correct.
Just to make that clear as well.
Mr. Chair, I'll move to adopt resolution number 2020-104, determining the Merriam Junction Sands LLC final environmental impact statement is adequate and approving the record of decision.
We have a motion.
Happy to second that motion, Mr. Chair.
And we have a second. Is there any further discussion? Not seeing any. I'm gonna see if Deb's out in the. We're ready for a roll call vote. We're looking
She
for.
thought this would take long.
She did. Well, and I think this part did go very, very quick. But as been mentioned, this has been a long process. So we'll just wait here and talk amongst ourselves.
You could actually take the roll.
Oh, here we go. Here she is.
So we could call the applicants up and grill them with questions.
Yeah, we could do that.
And just before we vote, just a reminder, we're approving that the EIS is adequate. We're not approving a permit, we're not approving anything. So just important for the record, because it
Yep.
did go fast.
It did go very fast, yes. There she is. Hi, Deb.
Commissioner Weckman-Brecky.
Aye.
Commissioner Wolf.
Aye.
Commissioner Beard.
Aye.
Commissioner Beard.
Aye.
Commissioner Ulrich.
Aye. All right, thank you very much. All right, we're gonna move on to item number 8 on the agenda, which is committee reports and commissioner updates. I'm gonna turn to my right. Commissioner Weckman-Brecky, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since our last meeting, I guess our last meeting was June 16th. That afternoon, I had a phone conference with Scott Vries, the Executive Director of MELSA, on 2021 budget planning. On June 17th, attended the Scott County Extension Committee meeting remotely. Did talk at that meeting a little bit about potential budget cuts for the next year and asked that committee to do some thoughtful work if that came to be, what their recommendations would be. It was good to see that we filled that committee again with an appointment today. On June 18th, had the MELSA board meeting. Discussions there really had to do with the different libraries, their reopening plans, their use of some of the MELSA funds for getting out more ebook material and making sure that everyone can still access services from the library. June 19th was the Dakota Scott Workforce Development Board meeting, again a remote meeting, hearing about unemployment rates in Scott and Dakota County, hearing from the businesses about challenges. There's high unemployment, but many of the businesses involved in that board talk about troubles getting people and hiring also. So we have kind of a double-edged sword there. On June 22nd was the SHAC meeting, the State Community Health Services Advisory Board. There we go. That meeting was remote and attended by the governor and the Commissioner of Health with updates on COVID and responses across the state. June 23rd, attended the Scott County Mental Health Advisory Committee meeting, and also that same day, the Live, Learn, Earn Educational Preparedness meeting. And then on June 27th, with most of the rest of you, I attended the Prior Lake 2113 ribbon cutting. That's the end of my report.
Thank you very much. Looking down to my left, Commissioner Beard, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the 19th, I attended the AMC board meeting. That was a virtual meeting for the statewide board. On the 22nd, the Community Health Improvement Consortium had their meeting, and that again was a virtual meeting. I will make just an observation that virtual meetings tend to go faster than in-person meetings. Just an observation. On the 24th, I was delighted to have breakfast with the administrator. For the first time in several months, we actually went to a restaurant, sat across from each other, and had a great time. It was nice to be with real people, wasn't it, Leslie? It was great. And the pancakes were just as good as I remember. On the 27th, of course, the ribbon cutting at the roundabout on 13 and 21. Pretty amazing to stand there and realize this has been coming for almost 15 years. I know they kept referencing 10 years, but it's longer than that. And there's actually pavement and curb, and to the citizens who are watching, we're actually going to take down the barricades one of these days now that we've cut the ribbon and painted the lines.
Very soon.
Very soon you'll actually be able to drive on it. On the 2nd, with Commissioner Ulrich, had the Transportation Committee meeting, and in the interim, a couple of conversations with some of our neighbors who serve on the Live, Learn, Earn Housing Workforce Committee, some offline comments and about where we're at and don't let the pandemic slow things down and so on and so forth. Mr. Chairman, that's my report.
All right, thank you very much. Commissioner Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On the 17th, the Insurance Committee met. We have some good numbers because this virus, nobody's been able to get in to get elective stuff and whatever. So it's actually, it's unfortunate, but nobody's been. Hopefully, we get a rebate somehow or another. But anyhow, then on the 19th, the Spring Lake Township met. On the 22nd, it met with our administrator Leslie Vermillion. On the 24th, the mosquito control met. Went over some budgeting and possibly some cost cutting because of maybe some shortness on revenues. On the 25th, the Vermilion River Joint Powers met. Kind of quiet there. Elko New Market met that evening. They've started up that roundabout out there on 2 and 91. So So hopefully that's done here in the next, hopefully month or two, so. And I had a meeting with the Prior Lake Mayor, and Credit River Town Chair that on the 26th. On the 27th, the ribbon cutting, and I thought it was about 20 years, I think Frank Boyle said, since that, not 15, so.
I could
it's-
believe 20 too, yeah.
It's been a while, so anyhow, and then on the 6th Newmarket Township, met with the chair out there, there's some road problems going on with the 22 and 91 roundabout, there, people are cutting and, you know, how they take shortcuts, and that's causing some problems, so. Then Prior Lake City, this was yesterday, 6th, watched their meeting on the television, and then Credit River Township met. They voted to become a city yesterday at their meeting, so that, I think that was actually a big deal.
That's a big deal.
And then Cedar Lake Township met, and everything's kind of quiet out there. I know there's going to be we're going to have a workshop here, and we're going to talk about broadband, and a few residents are concerned, you know, there's some areas that there's not a lot of, you know, high-speed internet, and that's a problem, and hopefully we can help them out with that. So that is my report.
All right, thank you very much. Commissioner Ulrich.
On the 17th, I attended the Transportation Advisory Board. There was a transportation survey with some pretty interesting information. Commuting has shrunk by 58%. Transit commuting has shrunk by 85%. There's been an 8-fold increase in teleworking. 216,000 metro workers that had never teleworked are now teleworking. That's 13% of the workforce. And it's unknown if all this is going to affect the transit patterns for the future, for permanently, and revenues are expected to drop, obviously, in the motor vehicle sales tax and transit fares. So we get a lot of changes coming in the in transit and transportation patterns. It's unknown what the new normal will look like. MBTA met on the same day. The CARES Funding Act for Regional Urban Transit, the money coming to the region for urban transit is $226 million. $12 million will be allocated to the regional providers, and $6.1 million will go to MBTA. June 22nd, the ST met to talk about how to have a strategy to meet with our legislators, and in regard to our concern that Met Council may want to try and eliminate the opt-outs during this time period or take them over. And so we had another strategy meeting also that on the 23rd with to discuss how to meet with our Met Council reps to discuss the same issue. So there's a large concern, great concern about what the Met Council might try and do with the opt-outs. I think particularly Southwest has heightened concern, and I think primarily because their area is being affected by the light rail, Southwest light rail coming right through their service area, so they're especially concerned. The 23rd, the chair, vice chair, 23rd, also the greater MSP board. They've been doing a lot of listening and with the community about police brutality, racism, police response to rioting and looting and protecting the public and protecting business. It's a big discussion that's going on. I hope we can have a similar discussion in our community. I think we may tilt towards concern about the protecting of businesses and the public and all this. Obviously, we're going to be concerned about racism and police brutality. Those are issues that need to be dealt with. But the fact that the Minneapolis Police Department failed in their mission that's on their police cars to serve with compassion and protect with courage, they failed dramatically in both counts. And so we need to have a discussion of how we're going to protect the public going forward if these events occur. It certainly isn't disbanding the police department is appropriate, but that's where they seem to be headed in Minneapolis. Minneapolis has to know that they have an obligation to the whole region. Our people come in to Minneapolis to work and do business, and they have an obligation to the whole region to keep their city and the whole region safe. And so they're not just acting on their own behalf. They should know that. They're acting on behalf of the region, and and we need to weigh in on some of these things, I would say. June 24th, the Fish Board of Directors. The 30th of June, the 169 Corridor Coalition. We're going to put off our 10-year anniversary celebration to next year, or have a greatly scaled down event associated with the ribbon cutting in the 169 project coming this fall. And one thing I think we learned about the Prior Lake ribbon cutting is to do the ribbon cutting immediately associated with the opening of a project, not a couple weeks ahead of time, because it just sets up criticism and poor expectation, or appropriate expectation, but for the public it's not met when you do a ribbon cutting. Most people expect the project to open, and so we think we've learned that we need to make sure ribbon cutting is immediately preceded by, or followed by the opening of the project. July 2nd, meeting with Leslie Vermillion, and on that same day we had a transportation committee meeting. We're submitting the top projects to MnDOT, our top 5 projects. We consolidated some. There was feedback from commissioners, county staff, and the projects were the 13, the Dakota Interchange, 169 Jordan Interchange, Trunk Highway 13 and 18 Roundabout, the Trunk Highway 169 Bloomington Ferry Bridge, a New River Crossing. Also consolidated in that was getting funding for the bridge redecking, and then 169 Bluff Drive. And I'm not sure if the staff had a concern about ponding and taking care of ponds, and that, I'm not sure if that was in the top 5. I'll have to get clarification from Leslie on that. Fish Executive Committee the same day, and then July 6th, conference call with Peter Frosch from Greater MSP. That's my report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My report will be similar to some of those. The 17th extension budget, I thought, many of us are out talking to some groups to say, hey, I mean, everyone knows that times are tough, and so I think they took that message well. I could not make the secondary meeting, but so that was underway. I have Father's Day written down here. I'm not 100% sure why. It was just awesome. It's a great Father's Day. 23rd, chair, vice chair. 24th, White House conference calls. Many counties around the country are able to dial into. 25th, fish board meeting. The 27th, the ribbon cutting the city hosted, 13/21. I would also just like to say that that was an outside event. We got a little close for the ribbon cutting, but I think we all mostly held our breath to get in the frame and move on. And yes, that road has been open in sections, but we are all waiting while it's completely open, which I believe the contract says the 15th, so we're hoping before that. And 7/1 fish fundraising meeting, and that is my report. Lots of discussion with folks on library and HHW, but we've all kind of been having those discussions as well, and we're
Lots of those, yeah.
Yep, lots of those, and we're moving forward, trying to push, and libraries will be open hybrid. Maybe you have an update on that?
Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, the libraries plan on opening in a hybrid model. We still have plenty of residents who prefer the curbside pickup and the
Right.
appointments based on their conditions as well and being able to access these facilities. And so on July 20th, the plan is to open towards the library being open for browsing and people to enter for a certain period of time, and then part of the time still providing the curbside pickup and the appointments for the computers. So it's kind of a hybrid model. And then we will monitor how many people are in the different libraries depending upon their size. Obviously Savage, Shakopee can hold more people than the Elko New Market or the New Prague Library at one time. So we're meeting the state guidance and guidelines on that. The household hazardous waste, they were pushing down to 10 minutes to try to get more appointments and keep moving through. Still waiting for an update on if we can do the 2 lines or 1 lines and still maintain that social distancing and continue. And, you know, in talking with folks, people appreciate the appointments. So I think even when you're talking with the public and encouraging folks that instead of coming and waiting in long lines and sitting in the car idling or waiting downstairs in a long line for an hour and a half, the appointments, you're here, you know your time, and you're out. And so even if some folks have to wait for an appointment to drop paint or something off, it is short, it's very efficient, and we're moving people through, so.
Leslie, or Mr. Chair, one question there. Any thoughts, and maybe not yet, but how to open the reuse room safely, requiring masks, one person, are we getting towards that?
I have not seen an update on the reuse room. I will look at that and get something out to you so you can talk to folks. I have not seen that one come up yet.
Well, and on that HHW, reuse is a lot of paint, pesticides, whatever else. I need a clarification for my own curiosity, but paint in Minnesota, we all pay to have it recycled when we buy it. Are stores required to take that paint, old paint, or any old paint back?
I'm not sure if it's required, but most of them will, is my understanding, and I can certainly get that from Kate too, and we can clarify it. The same thing with tires. Most places that sell tires also take tires back. And so oil, tires,
Right,
paint, I
right.
think there are some requirements for folks, but we'll get Kate and we'll
Yeah.
get that so we clarify it.
And that would be good to put out on social media
Yes.
and other things to just help, because we all know during COVID, people have
Oh,
done more
man.
clean out.
Yikes.
And now we have piles of things, and I have heard of a few more occasions of dumping going on in the country. So if we can just
Yes.
keep information going out where people can get rid of things, it would be helpful.
Yep, I will track her down and we'll get that information out. The other thing that I was going to hit on, Commissioner Ulrich asked about the transportation. So no, we did not list the ponding with the townships in MnDOT and the 41-169 issue as one of the top 5. We are opting to try to work through that issue. Some of the issue for MnDOT is there's runoff from the township's property or the landowner's property into these ponds, so it's not all MnDOT. And when you get to regional ponds, that's part of the issue then, who should pay and who should maintain. The county has no roads involved with them, so that's part of the issue. We would maintain and take care of ours. But we are trying to work through that, as well as the turnbacks. So when we make these major infrastructure improvements, like at 69, at 41, the local roads have to play a role in those connections. The county doesn't provide those types of roads to a single housing development or something like that. We've now taken on plowing over bridges and wider, broader county roads. But so we're trying to work through those through discussions and meetings because they're kind of policy level. But that is a concern for the highway department, has been getting folks to the table to talk through the ownership of those ponds. The other one was the 494, I think 35 interchange. And we also included that in our letter, though not the top 5 in Scott County, which I think is what the request was. It has a huge impact on our residents and the travel shed for Carver, Scott, Dakota County, and into Hennepin, and has congestion levels that impact our residents and our businesses. And so as part of that letter to MnDOT listing the 5 priorities within Scott County, we also noted the data and the information on 494 and 35, that this board strongly encouraged MnDOT to build the complete project and not some smaller project that would only solve an issue here or there, but that we actually had a vision that would have vehicles and people move through that interchange.
Did we get a copy of that letter?
We certainly can.
Thank you.
The last thing that I was going to just comment on is your calendar, the blue sheet that goes out with the agenda on it. The upcoming meeting lists a board meeting at 10 o'clock on July 28th. That's actually the budget workshop. It's a work session, not a board meeting, so I just wanted to clarify that for you, that we do have a 10 o'clock work session that day on the budget, and it's at 10 because the chair-vice chair meeting is from 8 to 10 that morning. That's what I
Awesome,
have.
thank you very much. Looking down to my right, any fireworks since it was 4th of July recently? Down,
Chair, Commissioners, nope, we have nothing to discuss.
nice, nice. No ooh-ahs, I like it. All right, with that, we come to item number 11.
Motion to adjourn?
Yep.
You need somebody to make it? All right, I'll make
You did.
We had a second before we had. We have a motion and we have a second. Any discussion? Otherwise, Deb, take it away, please.
Commissioner Weckman-Brecky.
Aye.
Commissioner Wolf.
Aye.
Commissioner Beard.
Aye.
Commissioner Beer.
Aye.
Commissioner Ulrich.
Aye.
We are adjourned.
Go. You get a 5-minute break?